My wife and I, she's actually back at the, we stayed the night in Keene. She's still in Keene, but we've had a nice trip to your state, and we're getting around and stopping in a lot of small towns and chatting with folks about our future. And it's really been a great trip. Let me just introduce myself a little more fully. I mean, I've met some of you before, but I am John Delaney. I am running for president. I'm from a blue-collar family, as the senator said. I grew up in New Jersey. That's good. Doesn't always get applause. My dad was a union electrician. He was a member of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, which is a terrific union. Neither of my parents went to college. I was the first in my family to go to college. My grandparents were immigrants. I went to Columbia University. As the senator said, that union, the IBEW, helped pay for my tuition, which has always been a reminder to me that none of us do it alone in this world. After college, I went to law school down at Georgetown, where the best thing that could have ever happened to me happened. I met my wife, and we've been happily married for 29 years. She's from Idaho. Her dad was a potato farmer, so you know, only in America the union electrician's son meets the potato farmer's daughter. And we've been blessed with 4 daughters, 26, 23, 19, and our little tag-along Grace, who's 12. April, my wife, has had an amazing career in her own right. She is one of the leading nonprofit attorneys that focuses on media literacy in children. She helped found a nonprofit called Common Sense Media, and her particular focus is on digital privacy for our kids, or in many ways the lack of digital privacy for our kids based on what's happened with these technology companies. After law school, I became an entrepreneur, as the senator said. I started 2 businesses. I was good at it. They became publicly traded companies. I was the youngest CEO in the history of the New York Stock Exchange way back when I was 33. My companies created thousands of jobs. They focused on lending money to small to mid-sized businesses all over the country. During the time I ran my business, we lent money to about 5,000 small to mid-sized businesses all over the United States, and then helped them create hundreds of thousands of jobs. My companies were always voted the best places to work, and the Obama administration actually gave us an award for our ethical lending practices in disadvantaged communities. But about 10 years ago, my wife and I decided to dedicate the rest of our lives to public service. We felt like we've been very blessed, and that we should spend the rest of our days giving back any way we can. That led me to run for Congress. I was first elected in 2012 to represent Maryland in the House, and I had a great run in the House. I was ranked the 3rd most bipartisan member of Congress, which I don't think is a dirty word, by the way, and that's led me to run for president. So that's a little bit about me. Blue-collar kid, successful entrepreneur, then have the privilege of serving my country. Many people call that story kind of the American dream, and I guess it is. But one of the problems we have today is it's just much harder for young people than it was for me. Young people today will be the first generation of Americans ever that do not do better than their parents. Think about that, the first generation ever. We're also leaving them debts that they cannot repay, both fiscal debts, if you think about the fiscal trajectory of our country, and environmental debts in the form of climate change, because it really is a debt that we're passing on to the next generation because we're not dealing with it. If you look at the condition of the world right now economically, about half of our citizens can't afford a surprise $500 expense. They're living just right on the edge. And about 40% of our country can't afford their basic necessities, their rent, their food, or their utilities. So how did this happen in this extraordinary country so quickly? Well, in my opinion, it's pretty simple. The world changed really fast, because of 2 things. Technological innovation, you know those devices that we all carry around, which are 120 million times more powerful, each one of them, than all the computers that we use to send someone to the moon. That's how rapid technology has progressed. Plus globalization. These 2 factors working together have changed everything. Now, they've been positive. They've lifted billions of human beings out of poverty. They've created innovations that none of us could have ever imagined. but they've also caused huge parts of our country to be left behind because it happened too fast and we didn't do the basic and most responsible things we should have done to prepare our country and our citizens for this change. And that's on us. Why didn't we do these things? Because we've been too busy fighting. A responsible nation would have a long time ago done things to improve our public education system so that our kids were getting the skills they actually need to either continue their education or get a job. Instead of what we have right now, where last year 71% of the high school graduates in the United States of America were not eligible for the military, according to the military, 7 out of 10. A responsible nation would have a long time ago improved our healthcare system. You know, my dad, the union electrician, had one job for 60 years, and he got his healthcare through that job. That system probably made sense if you were going to just have one job, but I think one of my daughters might have 15 jobs based on how dynamic the economy is likely to be. Does it make any sense to tie your healthcare to your job if that's the future? Issue after issue, there are things we could have done and should have done to prepare our citizens for the world. But we didn't do it because we've been too busy fighting. Which is why I believe what the American people don't need is more partisanship, more rigid, uncompromising ideology, or more gridlock. They need solutions, real solutions that get at the core institutions of our society. Solutions that work, that we know how to pay for, and that can actually get done. We don't need impossible promises. We don't need bumper sticker slogans posing as policies. We need leadership. Leadership who wants to step forward with real ideas, new ideas that can get done and make sense. And that fundamentally is what my campaign is about. Whether it's in healthcare, where I've proposed a universal healthcare system, where everyone gets basic healthcare as a right, but I don't make private insurance illegal, because I think that's bad for the healthcare marketplace, and I also think half the country has private health insurance, and about 100 million of them like it, so we'll never win any elections if we run on that. Whether it's on education, where I want to do things at each stage of the educational pathway, expand early childhood education, make pre-K universal for every kid in this country because it's the single best investment we make. Kids who have pre-K have an entirely different educational trajectory than the kids that don't. Do things to improve what's going on in the classroom. So many teachers in this country are so underpaid and they have to buy their own supplies. Create a system where community college and career and technical training is part of basic public education so that when everyone graduates from high school, they have some opportunity to get the skills they need for the rest of their lives. Again, these are real solutions. They can get done. They're not impossible promises. But we're not going to be able to do any of these things unless we come together as a nation. You know, in 1958, John F. Kennedy gave a speech in Baltimore, Maryland. He was a senator at the time. He wasn't yet president. And in this speech, he said, we should not seek the Republican answer. We should not seek the Democratic answer. We should seek the right answer. He went on to say, we should not seek to fix blame for the problems of the past, but we should own our responsibility as Americans for our future together. And what was interesting about that speech, because that phrase really resonated with me, is that he gave this speech 4 weeks after something called Sputnik was launched. You all remember what Sputnik was. If you go back and read the history books, in 1958 when Sputnik was launched, the American people were panicked. They didn't know what it meant. They thought they had lost their future. But great leaders like John Kennedy stepped forward and said, no. Our future is ours to build, but we have to build it together. Not as Democrats, not as Republicans, but as Americans. And I think we're at a similar moment right now. It's not one rocket into space, but it's a convergence of all of these powerful forces that are reshaping everything in our world. Our economy, the future of jobs, how we interact with each other, how we get news and information, what our national security risks are. They've all changed. And we have to respond to these changes. And we can. We have every advantage any nation could possibly want to have in 2019, except for one. We have a broken political system. And unless we respond to these changes, it will continue to destabilize our own country politically, which is really what has happened. And it'll put us in a position where we can't do what we need to do globally, which is to play the indispensable role that I believe the United States of America has to play in building the global world order. So all of these things are related. And this is what my campaign is about. Restoring this notion of common purpose. You know, that we're all in this together, united we stand. I actually think those things are the beating heart of this nation. And they're worth fighting for every single day of our lives. Every single day of our lives. When I'm inaugurated president, I want to look out at the American people and say, I represent every one of you, whether you voted for me or not. And to prove it, in my first 100 days, I'm going to champion about 5 big ideas in infrastructure, climate change, in immigration, in healthcare, in technology policy, but every single one of them will be based on an existing bipartisan bill in the Congress of the United States. I won't change a word of them, because I want to say to the American people, look, at your representatives, good-minded Democrats and Republicans, have found common ground on this list of things. What that means, we agree with each other. Let's do these. Let's start getting America working again. I'm going to call for national service. Not mandatory, but an exciting program that every high school graduate will want to join. Whether they either join the military, or they do community service, or they become part of a climate corps, which will be young people going around the country helping communities build sustainable infrastructure. Or just an infrastructure program generally. Wouldn't it be amazing if a young kid from New Hampshire roomed with a kid from Seattle down in New Orleans right after high school to be part of a climate corps together? They'd realize we have so much in common with each other. They'd have a sense of service instilled in them for the rest of their lives. They'd get some skills. They'd think about what they want to do with the rest of their lives. We could give them breaks on their student loans if they go to college, or if they could get a certificate for the skills that they've learned. But every one of us would benefit, because we'd see those kids and we'd say, we did that. We're doing things again. You see, I don't just want to, I'm not running for president just to be your president. This is not about me. I'm running for president to do the job. And to me, the job is to work incredibly hard to take this terribly divided nation, to start bringing it back together, and to start getting things done in infrastructure, in healthcare, in public education, in jobs, helping people with their pay, things that matter to the American people. That's what my campaign is about. It's about real solutions that work, that I figured out how to pay for, and that I can get done. It's not about impossible promises. It's not about a bunch of bumper sticker slogans. It's about this notion that in 8 years, we don't want to be talking about these issues anymore. We want to do something against them. Because we can, and we should, and we must. Because if we don't, we're not going to fulfill our most fundamental responsibility, which is to leave the world better than we found it. Because we're not doing that now. But we can. But we have to do it together. And to me, that's the calling of the Democratic Party at this moment in time. And that's why I'm running to be your president. Thank you for having me, and I'd love to answer your questions. So who wants to start? Yes, sir.
I just learned that the United States Department of Agriculture is being moved to Kansas in an effort to get rid of all the experienced and
I'll repeat the question.
talented people in the department. I would like to know why we can't stop this insanity.
The question is that the proposal is to move the Department of Agriculture from Washington, D.C. to Kansas. which would, what's your name, sir?
Jim Hoffman.
Jim, which, as Jim points out, would basically deprive the department of a lot of the talent and resources that it currently has. We all know why this is being done. It's about politics.
Of course.
This is not about what's in the best interest of the United States of America. Now listen, I've made some proposals that are consistent with that in some ways, but are much better thought out. I wouldn't move any of the departments out of DC because I think they have tremendously dedicated federal workers who have skills that are valuable to the taxpayers of the United States, and I wouldn't want to disrupt that or cause that upheaval. But let me tell you one thing I propose, Jim, which is on a go-forward basis. I want 25% of the government contracts in the country, because we're the biggest buyers of goods and services in the world, the U.S. citizens, through the government contracting department. I want 25% of those contracts to go to companies that have half of their employees in communities that are struggling economically. So I don't want to disrupt the current federal workforce, which is what's being proposed. But what I do want to do, in an effort to ensure that we're creating jobs everywhere in this country, because we're not. If you actually look at the data, most of the new jobs are going to about 6 big cities in the country. In fact, last year, 80% of the money for new businesses went to 50 counties in this country out of 3,000. That doesn't lead to a stable political system when you have a concentration of economic opportunity in a relatively small number of places. One of the ways I want to deal with that is to require 25% of our government contractors to have half their employees in communities that are left behind. So that's a much smarter way of doing what that dumb idea is trying to say. What that dumb idea is trying to say is all the jobs shouldn't be in Washington. They should be all over the country. And I'm like, well, I don't disagree with that, but let's do it through the government contracting process. So thank you, Jim.
Congressman, I don't think that that's the purpose. I think the purpose is to get rid of the scientists.
Yeah, what's your name? Carolyn. There's a whole, you're right, there's a rejection of science going on among this administration, which is dangerous. Whether it's on climate or any number of things, there's a basic rejection of science. I do think that what Jim is talking about is more about politics, because I've listened to these proposals in the Congress for a long time, where a lot of people, a lot of Republicans who come from other parts of the country other than the coast have advocated for years to locate parts of the federal government in other parts of the country. And listen, maybe if you were starting from scratch, some of these might be good ideas, but we're not starting from scratch. And what they're going to do here is hurt the department. It's just like kind of what they've done with the State Department. The State Department has been gutted. And it's actually a big deal, because the State Department's a unique place. It's filled with these career public servant diplomats who spend most of their career all over the world in postings in countries, some of them in dangerous places, developing relationships and contacts and expertise that is an asset to the United States of America. And under this administration, they've proposed to cut the State Department by 30%. Send a terrible message to these career diplomats, most of which are now taking early retirement, and is depriving our citizens of one of our great foreign policy assets, which is the State Department of the United States. Yes, sir.
What will you do to address income and wealth inequality in this country?
What's your name, sir?
Dick Ames.
Dick. So a couple things. I think you need a short-term and a long-term strategy to address income and wealth inequality. So let me tell you what I would do on the short term to start narrowing the gap. The first thing I would do is a series of initiatives to make sure workers have a living wage. So I would increase something called the earned income tax credit. You know what the earned income tax credit is? The earned income tax credit is, in my opinion, one of the greatest tax provisions we have. It puts money right in the pockets of hardworking Americans who are earning on the lower end of the pay scale. But they have to work to get it, which is why it used to enjoy bipartisan support. I've called for it to be doubled. And I want to rename it the workers' tax credit because I think the earned income tax credit is a terrible name, actually. So I'm going to double the workers' tax credit. You do that, and you combine that with raising the minimum wage, and you combine that with paid family leave. You get a package of kind of enhancements, if you will, that will lift tens of millions of workers up to a living wage. So that's something you can do right away to begin to close the gap, but more importantly, you're lifting up people. I'm going to pay for that, what I just described, because everything I tell you I'm going to do, I'm going to tell you how I'm going to pay for it. Because I don't want to leave my kids and your grandkids these debts that they can't repay. I'm going to pay for it by making a change, or really two changes to the tax code that also get at the issue. I'm going to roll back the tax cuts on high earners that was done as part of the last tax cut bill. And then I'm going to do something that Ronald Reagan did. I'm going to make the capital gains tax rate the same as the tax rate that people pay who work for a living.
This is what he proposed for the state of New Hampshire.
Oh, you did? I didn't know that. And Ronald Reagan was the last president.
It's in the House budget, which was vetoed by the governor.
Ronald Reagan was the last president to do that, Dick. I'm sorry, I forgot about your position in the House. So when I addressed you, I apologize for that, sir. Ronald Reagan was the last U.S. president to actually do that. And he actually gave a great speech. I found it. He said, why should someone who works for a living pay more in tax than someone who invests for a living? And he's right. He's 100% right. This has been one of the great fictions. If I wasn't in such a nice, good mood today, I'd say lies perpetrated on the American people. This notion that wealthy Americans need to be treated like endangered species. You know, like the white rhino. You can't touch them or we might lose them. Wealthy Americans will invest every nickel they have, no matter what the tax rate is. They're not going to sit on their money. You know, I spent my whole career in business. Started 2 companies, took them public, was the youngest CEO in the history of New York Stock Exchange Company. I dealt with investors. No one asks, what's my tax rate before they make an investment, right? They want to know if it's a good investment. And right now, these folks pay about a 20% rate on their earnings, because most of their earnings come from investments. And workers could pay, mid-30s. So I'm proposing to close that gap. By the way, that raises a lot more money than raising the top marginal rate. Because other than movie stars and athletes, very few wealthy people make their money through a paycheck. They make it through investments. And this is the tax rate that they pay. They could care less about that tax rate. They care about this tax rate. So what I'm going to do as president is I'm going to create fairness in the tax code so that if you work for a living or you invest for a living, you can do either. Good for you. If you're fortunate enough to have made money and invested, great, but you're going to pay the same amount in tax as the folks who work for a living. And those two things together in the short term, I think will start getting at income inequality. That's the short term. The long term is we have to do 2 things. We have to make sure the educational system is actually giving people the skills they need to get a job where they can earn a decent living. And we have to make sure economic opportunity is broadly available throughout the whole country, instead of just a small number of places. So that's how I'll deal with it in the short and the long term. Yes?
Hey, as a former business owner, you have a perspective on corporate tax rate.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, what do you think the current GOP tax law gets wrong about the corporate tax rate, and what would you,
It's
as
too low.
president, change?
So what's your name?
Olivia.
Olivia? So Olivia asked about the corporate tax rate, and what I'm just going to repeat the question because this divides the room a little bit. Olivia just asked about the corporate tax rate, and I'm very happy you did because I have strong opinions on this. So the corporate tax rate was 35%. That was probably too high. When Bill Clinton raised it to 35%, which he did, all of the countries we competed with had about a 35% tax rate. And so Bill Clinton said, well, we should just be where our competitors are. He was right about that. But since then, most of the countries we compete with have pretty dramatically lowered their corporate tax rate. And that created kind of a competitive dynamic for the United States companies. It wasn't as good as it should be. So people like myself and President Obama proposed reducing that corporate tax rate to about 28%. And we proposed to pay for that by getting rid of some loopholes. Right, because when I ran my company, we paid the full rack rate corporate tax rate, 35%, because we didn't have any special loopholes. But the average rate that companies paid was 21, 22, because a bunch of companies pay 0 or 5%. And I always thought that was actually unfair. So what I had proposed in the past was to make it like 27, 28, get rid of the loopholes, and then everyone will pay about the same. We'd get the same amount of revenues, it would be simpler, and the headline rate would be lower. That's what I proposed. And President Obama as well. The business community lobbied for 25. You know, the Chamber of Commerce, the Business Roundtable, all these big business groups said 25 is what we need. If we could just have 25, we would compete. So in some ways, the debate was 25 versus 27, 28. Suddenly, I'm sitting on the floor of the House of Representatives, and the final draft of the GOP tax plan comes through, and it says 21. And I remember saying to one of my colleagues, who was a Republican, who's a friend of mine, I said, no one even asked for this. Like literally, no one asked for a 21% tax rate. They wanted 25. So what I'm gonna do as president is I'm gonna raise that back up to kind of that 26, 27, 28% rate. Because 35 was too high, and I wanna make sure we compete. But I don't think we've gotta have the lowest tax rate in the world. Because we offer a lot to these companies, right? We don't have, this shouldn't be a race to the bottom. I'm gonna get a 26, 27, 28, and with that money, every 1% of the corporate tax rate is $120 billion. That money I'm gonna use, together with a couple other things, to fund a $2 trillion infrastructure program. Because how much better would this tax plan have been if instead of cutting the corporate rate from 35 to 21, they cut it from 35 to 26 or 27 and launched a $1 trillion plus infrastructure plan as part of it. How much better would that be? That would have been a lot better for business, actually. So that's what I'll do, Olivia. Thanks for the question. Yes, sir. And then we'll go around this whole table here.
Impeach or not?
That is the question. The question is impeach or not. You know what my answer is? I think we should follow Nancy Pelosi's lead. That's my answer. Nancy Pelosi is one of the most impressive people I've ever met in my life. And I've had the privilege, because of my prior career, to meet a lot of very smart, impressive people. She is as impressive as anyone I've ever met in terms of just the full portfolio of talents. She's got them all. I think she knows more about whether to impeach the president than all the 2020 candidates combined. She is the single person defending our democracy right now at this moment in time. She's the most powerful Democrat in the country, and she's holding it all together. And I think she's made for this moment. All of her experience across her career. So my view is, on this field of play, she's our captain. And I'm a team player. And on the field of play of impeachment right now, she's calling the shots, and I support her decisions. That's my honest hand to God where I am. I don't feel like I'm in a position to have a better insight into what to do in terms of impeachment than Nancy Pelosi does.
How will that affect presidents in the future? Does that give them license to cheat and steal and be corrupt?
You have to remember, and Nancy Pelosi understands this, obviously, because I said it on the debate stage the other night, I believe this president has been lawless. But impeachment is a political process. We make a mistake to think that impeachment is somehow like a legal court of law. It is not. It is as far from that as anything we have. It is effectively a supermajority of the Congress of the United States saying a president should go. And they are all politicians. The Founding Fathers put impeachment in place so that the Congress could get rid of a president that the majority of the American people want gone for whatever reason. If a president moved to Fiji for 6 months, or Tahiti, and hung out on the island, didn't break any laws, just sat back on the beach and said, hey, this is pretty nice here, I got Air Force One parked right on the runway, and I'm gonna sit on the beach. It's not clear what the high crime and misdemeanor is, but you're damn sure he or she would get impeached for that. And that's the point. And right now, what Nancy Pelosi, I believe, understands is that a significant majority of the American people do not want this president impeached. In fact, not even the majority of them do. So what she's gonna do is investigate, and see where that takes her. If it takes her to the point where the American people continue to learn information and their public sentiment changes, because the one thing Nancy Pelosi always quotes is Abraham Lincoln, public sentiment is everything. And she's right. If public sentiment gets behind impeachment, I don't think she'll right away. But I think she's playing it smart, I really do. That's my honest, I know it's not always the most popular thing to say, but that's actually honestly what I believe. This young woman, and then we're going to do something.
Totally change the subject.
Good.
I just, for the record, healthcare is my number one
Yep.
issue. Okay, but that's not my question. I just wanted to put it out there.
We'll get to it, I'm sure.
Okay. Where do you stand on NATO? It's not in any of your literature. It was not
Oh, it's-
brought up during the debate.
Yeah, unfortunately, we didn't talk about foreign policy. I'm very pro-NATO. I'm sorry, was that the fullness of your question there? I didn't want to cut you off. I'll explain
No, and
it
I
more.
would like to, why you're pro-NATO.
So I'm pro-ally.
Okay.
But I think one of the great assets the United States of America has is our portfolio of allies. It's unmatched in the world. No one has anything like it. China and Russia would kill for the alliances we have. And the reason we have these alliances is because we've worked for 70 years to create them, meticulously. And our view was, hey, we can have an outsized influence in the world if we work through a series of relationships with allies. And NATO is the greatest manifestation of that. It is the most successful alliance the world has ever created, in my opinion. And we built it for our own self-interest. That's what Trump doesn't understand. He thinks we went into NATO kicking and dragging, whereas it was our idea. Yeah, of course I want countries to contribute more, but I really want NATO to be strong. So this is where I think this president really diverges from what's in the national interest of the United States of America. He doesn't believe in allies, which is why when he's dealing with China, he's going it alone, which is the wrong way to deal with China. He, in many ways, is like the Chinese. The way the Chinese think about foreign policy is transactional. You're a country, you're poor, you need a port, we'll build it, we get to use it, if you don't pay us back, we'll take it. That's their foreign policy. And they're doing that all over the world. Because there's a lot of countries that need their money. And that's how they're building relationships. The United States is entirely different. We actually sell a set of values. A set of, kind of a relationships and a vision for how the world should unfold for peace and security, with us at the head of the table. Now, we're not perfect. We all know that. We've made big mistakes. We all know that. But in general, I agree with that philosophy. So I'm very pro-ally. And in many ways, that makes me somewhat traditional in terms of how I think about foreign policy. But the difference in me and other people is I think that has to be applied differently because the risks of the world have changed because largely of technology. And it's creating borderless states, it's creating ways of communicating that are very different, it's changing our national security risk, and we have to reimagine the alliance model in a world that's changed. But I'm very pro-ally and very pro-NATO. Sure. Yes, sir. Yeah, yes, sir. What's your name?
Ken.
Hello, Ken.
Greetings. I wonder, you have great ideas. You have a solid sense of America, I think.
Thank you.
What job, assuming you don't become president, would you like in the next administration to use your full talents?
Well, you know how I just said Nancy Pelosi always quoted Lincoln, which she does? Most of us quote Lincoln because he had so many good lines. So Lincoln had a really good line when he said, "I can only paddle to the next bend in the river." Kind of a simple way of thinking about it. So for me, the next bend in the river is winning the Democratic nomination, and I'm paddling like crazy for that. Yes, sir.
Glenn.
Hello, Glenn. And then I'll come over here, sorry.
Follow up your comment on foreign policy.
Yes.
If you give us something of your own exposure to the international field. Secondly, what is your approach to Afghanistan? And thirdly, question that I and several others put to our decision makers prior to invasion of 2003. What is the difference between a Sunni and a Shi'i, and how is Saudi Arabia somewhat different?
Well, so, as you know, most Muslims in the Middle East identify as Sunni. And the Sunni-Shia divide really does organize along traditional tribalism how the Middle East is organized, as you know. With largely Iran representing Shia and Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states representing Sunni. You know, and Sunni, because it's so big, has a very broad range of ideologies. It can manifest itself in ISIS, or it can manifest itself in a very peaceful form. Yeah, I think Saudi Arabia, you know, listen, I think we've got some real issues right now in Saudi Arabia. You know, I think what they did with Khashoggi was atrocious, and I think there hasn't been accountability, and that there has to be a bit of a reset in the relationship, basically. Working backwards, Afghanistan. We have about 14,000 troops in Afghanistan right now. I, as president, would want to withdraw them as much as possible, but I don't believe you can get it to zero. And this is where I want to be honest with the American people. I think with respect to Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, we need specific goals for each country. The goals for Afghanistan and Iraq are really the same. We don't want to create a situation where they could breed terror, because that's the reason we went there. And that, in my judgment, requires there to be a small force remaining to work with local security apparatus to ensure that it doesn't become a breeding ground of terror. I don't think you need 14,000. I think you can pull most of them out over time. And the same thing in Iraq. Syria's got some different challenges. You know, Syria, we have a situation where the Kurds haven't been settled, and they were really true allies in fighting on the ground and did a lot of the stuff we didn't want to do. We can't really pull out until there's a resolution for them. And there's also about 70,000 ISIS fighters that are currently in prison camps. And there has to be some resolution of that, or we're going to have another wave of this. So I'm a little loath to completely pull out of Syria. Now, our forces in Syria are much smaller right now, right? It's a couple thousand people. My foreign policy experience, in the Congress of the United States, I traveled all over the world, met with world leaders, visited our troops, and as a member of Congress, I had to deal with these issues extensively. In my prior life, in business, I traveled around the world in business. Very different set of exposures, but it gave me an understanding about how the global economy works. So I think my business career told me how the global economy works, and my time in Congress gave me exposure to world leaders, specific foreign policy issues, and the privilege of spending a lot of time with our men and women in uniform. So let's maybe, any questions over here? If not, we'll come back. Going once, going twice, going back.
So
Okay, well, you got it. You just missed it. We'll come back to you next. Thanks.
we're all.
What's your name, ma'am?
My name is Marjorie.
Marjorie.
And like everyone else here, probably, I am livid and upset and can't sleep because of what's happening in the concentration camps in our whole.
Yeah.
Yes.
There is a Light for Liberty rally on Friday at the Renowned Historical Society, 5 to 7 on Friday, folks. What can you do to fix this?
Well, I can become the next president, and then I can fix it. I mean, look, at the end of the day, we have to reform our immigration system. And I'm going to put in my first 100-day agenda comprehensive immigration reform, similar to what happened in 2013. We've got to get that passed.
But we have an immediate problem.
I understand. I'm going to get to
Immediate question.
I'm just going to go through the whole thing.
Okay.
And I'm going to conclude, because I've been down the border a bunch recently, including to detention facilities, so I'm going to conclude on that point. I'm going to get over the basic stuff first. So, comprehensive immigration reform. I'm going to launch something called Plan Central America, which is an effort that was modeled off something called Plan Colombia, which was successful, where we can actually help stabilize civil society in the 3 Central American countries that are causing all the migration. Because unless we do that, we're going to continue to see massive amounts of migration from these countries. And what I want to do within my first 90 days as president is convene a summit with all the South American, North American countries that are in a position to do it, and other allies from around the world, and NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and develop a plan to actually try to build independent law enforcement and judiciary in the 3 countries, because that is the root cause of all the migration. Because unless we do that, we're going to continue to see massive numbers of people migrating across our borders. And it will continue to be an unsustainable situation, and the political system of the United States of America will ultimately lead to the point where we reject them all. Because we just have to realize that that's where the American people will ultimately be on this issue unless we can stabilize what's going on. So let's talk about what's going on the border. Obviously, we should never, ever separate children from their families, ever. The conditions of these facilities should reflect a measure of human dignity, full stop.
So they should be detained?
When people cross the border, we have a legal immigration system in this country. That includes, by the way, seeking asylum. That's a legal process. But when people cross the border, the customs officials of the United States of America do have to process these people and figure out, are they seeking asylum? Are they not? What do we do with them? And so yes, there has to be some aspect of detaining people while that is sorted out. There's no other way to do it.
There wasn't detention before Bill Clinton. There weren't detention centers when people crossed.
I'm not aware of whether there were.
Yeah,
So let me tell you I went down to a detention facility in Dilley, Texas, which is the largest detention facility. I don't know if you're familiar with this facility. It had 1,700 women and children when my wife and I went there in January. And the reason we went there is because we took 14 law students and 2 law professors for a week on a trip that we personally sponsored to go and help the asylum seekers make their case. So I actually went there into the Dilley facility, I toured the Dilley facility, and I spent time in the legal aid clinic with my wife, who's a lawyer, and 14 law students from Georgetown Law's legal immigration clinic, or not immigration clinic, and 2 law professors. And we helped the asylum seekers make their case. Because when people come to this country, they claim asylum. Then they have to prove a certain preliminary standard called credible fear to be granted asylum, but it's temporary asylum. Then they have to be transported to a sponsor, which is either their family or a nonprofit that's sponsoring them. And this is where the detention actually does come in, because they have to get, who's ever sponsoring them has to send the money to transport them to that place. And that has to happen for these people to actually end up with their sponsors. And we ended up transporting some of these people to their sponsors. So we need to make sure these facilities treat people with dignity. We should not separate children from their parents. We need to fix the situation in Central America, and we need to pass comprehensive immigration. That's what I think we need to do.
Thank you for your honesty.
No, that's what I believe. Listen, my grandfather was actually separated from his family when he came to this country. He came here in 1923 with his 7 brothers and sisters and his mother from Europe. And they were all let into the country, as was his mother. So his 7 brothers and sisters and his mother get let in. But he was stopped at Ellis Island. He was a boy. And the reason he was stopped is because he was disabled. And we didn't let disabled people into the country at that time. So his 7 brothers and sisters get let in, his mother gets let in, they stop him, they detain him, and they send him to Staten Island to be deported. He's there for a while, and finally his family gets him an appeal. His disability was he had 1 arm. And the appeal was held in the Great Hall of Ellis Island. Hundreds of people waiting for the appeal. He's in the back of the room, he's a little boy, he's got 1 arm, he's scared, he doesn't know what's going to happen, he assumes he's going to get deported. And the judge walks in to hear all these appeals. They're probably like 10 seconds each. And the judge walks in and is putting on his robe, and as he's putting on his robe, my grandfather, from the back of the room, sees that this judge also has 1 arm. Which is the only reason he was let into the country. Because the 1-armed judge looked at him and said, I'll let you in, make something of your life. So a little bit of shared humanity at the border every once in a while can make a big difference in people's lives. I wouldn't be here but for that. So when I was down the border with my wife, one of the reasons we went there is we said, listen, I just don't want to talk about this stuff, I want to do something about it. So we went down there, we took these lawyers, and we sat there and I listened to these women making these cases as to why they were leaving their country. Because what you got to do is you got to help them formulate their pitch to the judge as to why they should get temporary asylum. And I tell you, if you listen to their stories, every one of us would leave too. Because they're all the same. They either murdered one of my children or they threatened to murder one of my children, they being the gangs. And I went to the law enforcement to tell them about this. And the law enforcement's in bed with the gangs. So what can I do? They're going to kill my kids, and the kids are sitting there with them. So they left. And unless we fix what's going on in the country, those countries, everyone's going to leave. Which is why when we talk about the situation at the border, we got to have humane conditions. We should not separate families from their kids or children from their families. But we also have to fix what's going on in these 3 countries. And we can do it. John, one more. Okay, sorry. I think this young woman there had a question.
I did, but did you want to follow up?
Yes, I do. One of the main reasons we're having this immigration storm is because of climate change.
Absolutely.
There's a huge drought in these countries right now.
Yep.
And the whole system has collapsed because of it. The only way they can make money is to pillage each other. And that's what's happening. This is the tip of the iceberg. You wait another 50 years and we'll have 1 billion people looking for a new home.
Yep. So I agree with you. And just to put your point, a sharper point on the issue you made here. So in Syria, 10 million people were displaced from their homes because of that tragic civil war. 10 million. And it largely has destabilized the political system in Europe. That's the consequence. In Bangladesh alone, one country, by 2040, they expect 20 million people will be displaced from their homes because of climate change. And in that part of the world, if you listen to the US military, people are being destabilized from the Central American countries. They're crossing into the United States of America. We're granting them asylum. And we're having this very big political debate about exactly how we do it. In Europe, 10 million people were displaced in Syria, 10 million people were displaced. They went to Europe, and it resulted in a massive kind of hard right movement of leaders taking over countries because their citizens wanted to close the borders. Where Bangladesh is, you know what they do when you cross the borders? They're going to shoot them all. There's not going to be detention facilities. There's not going to be arguments about how we take asylum. That's why the military calls climate change a threat multiplier. Because they're charged with policing these parts of the world. There's no one who wants conflict less than the US military in these parts of the world, because they know they will be forced to be involved. And they see exactly what this is going to do, which is why we have to deal with climate change. So let me conclude with my climate plan, because I think it is not only the best plan in terms of actually getting something done to address the issue, but it also deals with it globally, because we have to think about climate as a global issue. Right? The United States is just a small part of this thing. So the goal on climate is we have to get to net zero by 2050. Zero net emissions by 2050. Unless we do that, the planet will warm more than 2 degrees Celsius, and all the bad scenarios and potentially worse will happen. So we got to get there. Which means the only way we're going to get there is to do something right away and to be realistic about the challenge. So one thing is we cannot solve climate change on the backs of workers. And the reason for that is it'll never happen, and we'll never do anything. So one of the things I proposed in the Congress, and I introduced on a bipartisan basis, the only bipartisan climate bill ever in the Congress was mine. It put a price on carbon, a carbon fee, a carbon tax, I'm okay saying it, and you make CO2 and fossil fuels related energies a lot more expensive as a result, and you cut emissions by 92%, according to all the models that were run. And it raises $3 trillion, and it increases energy costs for fossil fuels related energy. And that's why people stop using them, they start using renewables. But what you do with the money is you give it all back to the American people. So you put a tax on carbon, it reduces the use of fossil fuels, the federal government raises a huge amount of money, you put it all in a lockbox, and you give a dividend to every American every year of all that money. And the reason that's important, it's the only way you'll ever get it done. The president of France put a price on carbon. He used the money to cut taxes of wealthy French people. And people put on yellow vests and went to the streets and protested. Because they said, you're raising my energy costs to solve that problem, and you're giving the money to rich people? The governor of Washington State, Jay Inslee, twice tried to pass a carbon tax in a Democratic state. His proposal was put a price on carbon, take the money, and have the government spend it on all kinds of green energy projects. Workers looked at that and said, you're going to raise my energy costs to spend money on stuff I don't know what you're going to do with it? And they rejected it by 15 points in a Democratic state. My proposal puts a price on carbon, raises the price of energy, and then I say to the same people who are about to get mad that I'm raising their energy prices, but guess what? You're going to get a check back every year as well, and that check will be more than what your energy costs went up. Because a carbon dividend is actually progressive. Workers get more back in the dividend than their energy prices go up. Rich people, their energy prices go up more than the dividend they get. And I got Republicans on that bill. I can pass that bill in my first year as president with every Democrat in the Congress and all the Republicans who live in coastal states. Because Marco Rubio and Rick Scott have to vote for something on climate because a majority of Republicans in Florida believe it's a problem. And so when people talk about their climate strategy, you should say, how are you going to get something done your first year? And I've just told you that. And no one else has a plan to get something done right away. And I've proven that I can do it. And then I'm going to do a few other things, including one thing that no one talks about, but I believe will save the world. So I'm going to increase the Department of Energy research budget fivefold, because we need new battery and transmission technologies, period. And we have to innovate ourselves out of it. No one's better at innovation than the United States of America. But we can't do it unless we have a moonshot around research. I'm going to launch the Climate Corps. I'm going to continue all the renewables. But then I'm going to do something completely out of the box. I'm going to build a whole new industry. And it's called direct air capture. What that really means is CO2 vacuums. These are machines that take CO2 out of the atmosphere. They exist. The National Academy of Sciences just did a huge review of them. They're viable, they're proven, they work. The problem with them is they're very expensive and they're small. which is, by the way, exactly what I would have said about wind and solar 30 years ago. I'd be standing in front of you and say, you know, wind and solar works, but it's like really expensive. It's not very practical. They're small scale. But what did we do? We created a market for them. And there was a huge amount of innovation. And these things have become cheaper than fossil fuels, and they're huge, and they work, and you see them everywhere, and there's a revolution going on. I'm going to do the same thing for direct air capture. I'm going to take the $50 billion that you all give in tax breaks to fossil fuel companies, right? Because that's the tax breaks they get, $50 billion. I'm going to take that money, and I'm going to use it to create a market for direct air capture, right? Which will encourage massive amounts of innovation and entrepreneurship around machines that actually suck carbon out of the atmosphere. Because the one thing I will tell you, and I believe this as much as I believe anything else, unless we remove 20% of the CO2 from the atmosphere, we will not get to net zero by 2050. We won't. Why? Because we produce CO2  5 different ways. Electricity is the number one. We can get that to net zero by moving to renewables. Cars, number 2. We can get that to net zero by having electric vehicles. But now the bad news. Airplanes and big ships. There's no electric alternative. Manufacturing produces CO2. No net zero alternative. And farming. While you can do a whole bunch of things to reduce the footprint, you can't get to net zero. So for those last 3 things, the only way to get to net zero is actually to remove the CO2 they produce. And it's not only, this is where it's a global problem. Because China, India, and Africa open a coal power plant every single week. So unless the United States of America does what it does best, and what we've always done, which is to put the intellectual capital that is unmatched in this country, and the innovation machine that is unmatched in this country, and build the technologies and the machines that can get us and the world to net zero, working with our very aggressive transition to renewables, we will not get to net zero by 2050. And that's what I will do as your president. So again, real new ideas, real solutions, not impossible promises. I've thought through how I'll do them all, and that's why I want to be your president. Because again, this is not about me wanting to be your president. I hope you can tell I want to actually do the job.
All right, let's
Thank
give
you
it up
all.
again for John.